Show us the trunk and what's in it.
So, here is your ND Miata trunk, which is around 4.5 cubic feet of space.
That's how you carry your stuff, is a sack?
Well, we don't talk about what's in there.
Oh, okay. Would you get the car in here? You don't have all day. Yeah, so Jessica, you're sitting in the car, so why don't you show people how easy it is to do?
So it meets you.
It's just, I mean, I can do it fully one-handed.
It's so light.
YouTube, come on, we're live.
I'm Brandon. Ian and I have been friends for a couple dozen years now.
Against my better judgment.
We both owned several Miatas over the years.
Okay, so we're calling this a real world owner review because here's the thing with this particular car. So I bought this car, this is what, a 2017? What year is it? I don't even know.
2016.
Okay, so I bought this car, it's a 2016, which was the first year of the MD, right?
Yeah.
I bought this in, 2017, I think? It was a year old when I bought it. So I was the second owner, but it hardly had any, it had 4,000 miles when I bought it, or 5,000 miles.
Something like that.
I owned it for how long, a year or two?
No. Maybe a little under a year.
And then you bought it from me, and you still own it today. But this is actually kind of your wife's car.
Yeah,
and we'll bring in Jessica later, because she's probably the one you'd rather see rather than us.
So as Ian hit upon, this is the ND generation of the Miata, which began in 2016. ND being the fourth generation of this car, which went through NA, NB, NC. You can follow the generations that way.
Yeah, so I've actually owned all four generations. So I had an NA, I think mine was like a 91 or something. Mm-hmm. I had an NB, what year was my NB? Like an 02? It was a later one.
Yeah.
I had an NB2, and then I've had two NCs. I had an NC1, I had an 06. It was a beautiful car.
Grand Touring.
What the color on that was that really cool green color. And I commuted in that car for 3 years. I hit a deer in it. I love that car. And then I was without a Miata for a while. Then I had an NC2, a blue, I think a stormy blue is what they call it, NC2 with a hard top. And then I've had the car you see here. So that makes a total of 5 Miatas I think I've had. So I've had all four generations. You've had...
We've personally owned 3 generations of it. We owned an NC before this car, third generation, an NC1 like Ian owned, a 2006 Grand Touring as well in silver. And we replaced that car with this one, and we can kind of talk about why we did that for several reasons. But then I'm also a current owner of an NA, a first generation 1996, which I've owned for almost 10 years and probably will never sell. So
Brandon wants us to talk about the generations of the Miatas. So, I mean, we don't have time to go into all of that, and there's a lot of good videos on YouTube. But basically, there's been 4 major generations of the Miata. But even within those, they've made major updates within the generations, right? So you've had the NC1 and 2. The ND now has 1 and 2. Yeah. We should probably explain that, right?
Yeah, so Mazda does things in a very evolutionary way. Not just with the generational changes, but what they do within those generations. And like he was saying, we've got the ND1, which is this car. It's a first year of 2016. And then in 2019, we went to what's unofficially referred to as the ND2.
And they actually have to do with the VIN numbers on the car, if I'm right? Because the NB, NC, ND part, that has to do with the VIN numbers. Because they actually correspond to a letter in the VIN number. That's why it gets those designations, right? I think that's right.
And so, Mazda not only makes some changes that you would see on their press releases, stuff that's worth talking about. But if you own these cars, especially a changeover from a ND1 to an ND2 or an NC1 to 2, you'll notice subtle little things that they don't really talk about in press releases, just little ways that Mazda continually improves these cars. Switch gear, the way they've moved things around, and just kind of the feel. You can tell that they're constantly working on their build assembly and build quality process where things just get better as the generation.
So maybe we should talk about why we own, both of us have owned this car now.
Yeah.
So I really just got it because, again, I had all the other Miatas at that point, and I just wanted the next step. And before I was married and especially before I had kids, that's the thing with the Miata. It's not a car that you can have when you have a family, unless it's your third car, realistically, because you know, the trunk space is tiny, we'll get to that, and there's no passenger space for a kid seat, a car seat or anything. I have like 80 cars, so it doesn't matter. I'm boring and married and with kids, so I only have 2 cars. But you have a whole fleet. So anyway, so why did you decide to buy this from me?
Because I felt like the ND was a really important evolutionary step in the Miata legacy. They've always been great cars to drive, tremendous fun factor, you know, 9 or 10 out of 10. And you just get a feeling in these cars that you can't achieve from very many things that maybe aren't, you know, 40 plus years old anymore, like looking back to British Roadsters, which really is what the Miata was about when it debuted in 1989 for the 90 model year, was really capturing that essence of the true British sports car, except now with Japanese reliability. Absolutely, Mazda will freely say that the Miata is their halo car, and it's a rare halo car for an automaker in that it's not necessarily that expensive or the most expensive in their lineup, but it kind of embodies everything that Mazda as a company is about, which thankfully they're still, you know, one of the last independents out there in the world. And I think that's one of the reasons why we both support Mazda in general and why we bought this car, because they have really held firm to what they've been about, which is driving enjoyment in something that it can also be reliable, like a Toyota Corolla.
Yeah, it's so hard. I always worry that they're going to have to get away from that, because the job of a corporation, I mean, shareholders employ the board and the board employ the staff, and their whole thing is to drive up shareholder price. And so if they could make some boring car that sells 1 billion units, that's going to be better for that purpose. But instead they're sticking to, you know what, we care about driving dynamics, we care about fun, and you can see that everything from their Mazda 3 to the CX-5 to the CX-9, everything they build. And go watch my other video, by the way, in the CX-5 review, which I'll link down here below. But you know, we both have always really liked Mazda as a company, like you said, independent, which is rare.
Yeah.
I mean, everyone else is so huge that they can't do stuff like this.
Absolutely.
And it's very expensive to build a sports car and engineer it, just dedicated that way. I mean, why do you think the Supra is a BMW?
Yeah,
because
a joint venture.
You know, Toyota, it does not even make sense for Toyota, a huge company, to invest in a sports car. So they team up with BMW for that.
So I give Mazda a lot of props for keeping their Roadster alive, but they see how important it is to the rest of their lineup, and kind of how that driving ethos trickles down to all those vehicles that Ian mentioned. You can feel it in a crossover like the CX-5 or even in the larger CX-9 that drive very well.
You really can.
And you know what? A lot of enthusiasts criticize vehicles like that, Ian, but they're very important to vehicles like this, because that's what pays the bills at these companies.
Yeah,
and
they
allows
have to
them
have the
do
CX-5
this.
so they can keep going as a company.
Absolutely.
And the CX-5 is a great vehicle, but yeah, it's a crossover, it's a boring car, whatever. But it still has a Mazda DNA. It allows them to keep doing stuff like this.
But I think it is important to talk about, you know, why was I compelled to move from an NC to this?
Yeah, so that's a
And
good
there are
point.
some-
So you had the NC, and then you upgraded basically to this.
Yes. So our 2006 NC was actually really nice. It was an extremely low mileage
It was the wrong color though.
silver.
Yeah.
Second owner car in awesome shape. For me, it was a couple things. Let's be honest. This car is a lot more dynamic looking, I think, than any previous generation Miata.
I agree with that. This was the first Miata where people come up and they're like, wow,
What is that?
That's a great looking car. The other Miatas, they kind of said, oh, that's a little bit feminine or whatever, which I never really...
A hairdresser's car,
Yeah,
a secretary's car.
Which, if you're a Miata person, you know is completely the opposite of the truth. Actually, most Miata buyers have always been male, and have always been sports car enthusiasts, is the truth. But it got that stereotype because of the styling, because of the size, the low engine power. But the NT has really started to change that for Mazda.
Yeah, and I think that was what really swayed my wife and I to get into this car from the 2006. Not only do you have this more dynamic styling, which, you know, looks are subjective, but I think it's a great looking car. This angle is fantastic on it. And this was the first Miata that took the Kodo design ethos that Mazda has put into place starting around 2014 with the Mazda 3 and the Mazda 6. And they translated it well to this car. It's got some very sharp creases and curves, but they also kept the classic proportions of the seating compartment being far back towards the rear axle, while doing some interesting things styling-wise. They really accentuated and lengthened this dash to axle ratio, which gives it a more powerful stance on the road. Just it has that longer hood, something more along the lines that you would see on something like a Corvette.
And what I noticed when you're driving it, you've got these kind of haunches on the side.
Yes.
It kind of makes it just feel more aggressive somehow, even when you're just sitting in the cockpit looking out on those big fender flares that come up into your field of view.
So I was actually at the debut of this car to the public, back in 2015, September now. So we're going back 5 years since this car was shown for the first time.
Yeah.
And they had the designer of this car there, and he talked very specifically about the fenders on this. When you sit in this car from the driver's seat, you see them very clearly on your right and left side, but you've got great vision down the hood. They kept the hood real low for vision on the road. But because of the way they intentionally placed those fender arches, you can clip apexes perfectly in this car. That was intentional.
Okay, so we've got the actual owner of the car. After her husband and her husband's friend talk about it for 6 hours, we finally got the actual owner of the car here. So, this is your car, which you used to commute before coronavirus took over the world. But what are the things, basically just tell us what you like and what you don't like about it, and how it compares to other cars that you've driven.
No, it's a great commuter car. I'm not going very far, but it just gives joy to the day. There's a lot to like about it. First of all, I'm not the strongest, or wasn't the strongest manual driver, and Miata is so forgiving. It allowed me to gain confidence to be able to drive this, all the way up here on a mountain road now. And it's a cool car. So my once upon a time before Corona office went out a lot for lunch, and coworkers enjoyed that. I would bring them Miata. People would say, "Ooh, no, I get to ride with Jessica today," because it's a fun car to be out on, whether it's just scooting around the coastal or coming up in the mountains.
Yeah, so you guys live in San Diego, which is like the perfect place in the world to own a Miata. So you definitely have to have a Miata when you live down, or some kind of convertible when you live down there. Well, you guys do. You have two Miatas, right? Well, what did you drive before this? You had the older Miata, right?
I had an older Miata.
Yeah.
And I'm gonna get shamed by my husband at not knowing what year it was, but it was an NC.
It was
the
an
generation
NC1.
before.
Yeah. You had that.
And this is a far improvement from that one.
In what way?
In everything.
Yeah.
The driving, the confidence, just the zippiness, the fun. The NC was pretty. It was nice. Also relaxing to drive, but I had difficulties with gears. Stop and go traffic, San Diego. First gear was near impossible. Only complaints about this car is the comfort. These seats for a drive just up here, 2 hours, is so uncomfortable. For me as a passenger, if my husband is driving, this whole wheel well here, transmission, whatever, but the leg room is terrible.
It is really cramped in here. If you're a big person, just forget this car entirely. The
A cup
Miata's always
holder.
been a small person car.
And you know what?
But the ND's even worse, I would say.
It's small.
And I can say that the NA, the first gen car that we own, doesn't have that problem. It has much wider footwells.
Yeah, the NA has other trade-offs, but you're right, it is better for the passenger.
Yeah, cup holder. You can't have this here with the passenger. This is where my knee's at.
Yeah, the first time I rode in this as a passenger, after I sold it to Brandon, we were driving around, I couldn't believe, because I'd always been in a driver's seat, and my wife never complained about it, because she doesn't know, to compare it to. But yeah, it is kind of a complaint for sure.
Yeah.
And it may sound stupid, but a lot of people complain about this. No glove box in this car.
Oh, that's right. There's no glove box anymore. The NC, I think, had one.
Every
Every previous Miata had one.
Had a glove box.
Yeah,
And
having
I
no
was
glove
about
box
to say,
is
I
dumb.
like that it doesn't have a glove
But
box.
Mazda will tell you that you have that.
You have this.
But
Yeah,
that's a
so
bit
did
hard
an
to get
NC.
to, though.
Right, so did the
Awkward
NC.
to get to, though.
Yeah, and the CD changer too is back here.
Oh, I
Yes,
forgot it
everybody
has a
uses
CD
Bluetooth.
changer.
I'm not a Bluetooth user. I like CDs.
She has old school CDs,
And I have to turn around and do this
You have
while
cassettes
driving.
as well. You have the cassettes.
8-track.
We didn't really talk about the audio system. I think that Brandon and I are both kind of haters of Bose, because Bose we feel is like, the artificial. People think it's good, but it's actually usually pretty bad. And it's a label. They basically, license the name to put in these cars and slap the label on so they can sell it for more money. But usually the components suck.
Yeah.
But how's the audio in this one? I don't remember it being too bad.
It's not terrible.
It's not terrible.
No highs, no lows, must be bows. But
Yeah.
in all seriousness, our prior car was a top trim level Grand Touring. And that also had the Bose branded audio system. And I can say this one is a good step better than that one. But it still is not great. There are a lot better options out there. Now, Mazda did bring the speakers back to the seats like they had in the first generation car.
Yeah, you can't see, but there's actually speakers in the headrest, which I don't know.
Which help
add
it
a
helps
little
on
bit.
the freeway
Yeah.
with the top down.
I noticed when you can actually like have a Bluetooth call with the top down.
I frequently do.
Which
I
was
used to
kind of
do all my
cool.
calls on the way home.
Yeah.
Yeah, so the Bluetooth works fine in this car, and actually that's a good point because the wind management is pretty decent in this car.
Yeah, that's the
with
wind
top
blocker
down.
up. The wind blocker also doesn't this fold down?
Removes.
Oh, it
On the
removes.
NC it folds
On the
down.
NC
Oh, yeah,
it folded.
Which I think is a better design than this.
This one pops off,
Yeah.
but usually you just leave it in place, you know.
So now wind management.
These wind blockers do a surprising amount of difference. You wouldn't think so, but they actually work.
So for those of you that have never owned a convertible, what you get oftentimes is this turbulent effect of the air coming back. It swirls around like this,
Yeah.
and you'll actually have your hair coming up from behind you.
Yeah.
And these help significantly with that. But the wind management, they did a better job in this car with the top down. It's a little bit quieter. It's a little bit smoother, less buffeting. It's not much of an improvement with the top up versus the older cars. And that's primarily because of this area where the door glass meets the top. It just seems to catch a lot of wind. But
Yeah.
look, at the end of the day, Mazda's priority was driving feel and keeping the weight down. Sure, they could have made a quieter convertible, but this is not a Jaguar XK. This is not a Mercedes SL. Cars that can be almost as quiet as a full-roofed car. This just isn't that. So if that's the experience you're looking for, you're probably not going to be that happy. Now, you may find that the RF, which is the retractable fastback version with, with the power Targa center section, may suit you a little bit.
Well, the
better.
RF is very divisive because I really love the way it looks. You hate the way it looks. Other people are split on it. And then practically speaking, I mean, you get the blind spot with that too because you got this big blind spot behind you. It's just personal preference. The soft top downsides are, you know, someone could just come up and slice it open.
Sure.
It's louder. But I tend to agree with you. I'd stick for a Miata. I kind of stick with the soft
This
top.
is just more the purest choice. And
Yeah.
hey, you know what? While we're on that subject, I gotta
is the
say,
easiest
this
one.
is by a long shot.
Yeah, so
the
Jessica, you're
best
sitting in the
top.
car, so
Yeah.
why don't
The-
you
the
show people
Mazda's
how
top.
easy it is to
Yeah,
do?
up, and
So it
pops
meets
up.
you.
It's just, I mean, I can do it fully one-handed.
It's so light.
And that's a big difference from the old Miatas.
The NA and
of
the
the
NB.
NB and the NB. You know, it's funny because I had the newer Miatas first, and then I went back and owned the old ones. And one of the things I hated about the NA and NB was how hard it was to do the top.
You had to
I
do
was
it from
spoiled.
outside.
Yes.
Yeah, you had to
Yes.
get out. This one I can do in 1 second from in the driver's seat, which is a big deal actually.
On the freeway.
This I feel like is an evolution of the last generation soft top. It operated similarly, but they did some nice things with this.
This is lighter.
They both have single latches, which is great. You could do both sitting in the car, but this one is just nicer because they've got a little spring assist in it. It meets your hand.
Yeah.
It's so light. It's just basically a flick of the wrist. There's no need for any of that power nonsense on this car. You don't need the complication, the hydraulics, the potential things that are going to fail. This is just a good solution.
Well, and I put it up on the freeway this afternoon. I mean, I
That's
was
true.
going 30 miles an hour, easily pop it up, put it on.
They probably don't advocate that in an owner's manual, but to be honest, that's another advantage of having the manual top and one that's so good like this.
I would just
versus
use,
a
I would
power.
slow down enough and then just do it.
Exactly, and it works great.
You can't do it at high speed because of the wind.
We've had times where it started to rain on us, and we were at a low enough speed. You just pop it over, problem solved.
But I'm more confident, like, with this roof on. I mean, the single latch. We had an incident on the 96, hit a weird wind gust with the roof up, and it unlatched. And we
On
had
the
to,
old car.
On the old car.
the
We had to
old
catch
latches.
the roof.
Yeah.
The
double-
latches on the old one were kind of
They weren't very
not
good.
cheap.
They weren't very good. So that's one of those things I can definitively say Mazda has done a much better job on the newer car. And the chassis stiffness, the structure, it just doesn't have the vibration and the cowl shake that you get in like the NA and NB cars.
Which is why I don't mind not having a glove box, because our glove box shakes and rattles, and I'm very sensitive.
That's
to
called
squeaky
character.
noises.
That they wanted you to still remember that it's like a British Roadster.
It's annoying.
For my money, I cannot think of a better sports car that I would buy. You could buy a used. What can you buy this car right now? What's the value on this car? Probably around high teens still, or
Yeah,
mid-teens?
you know, you can pick up these ND generation cars, you know, probably $15,000 to $20,000. The earlier ones. That's a great value. I mean, come on, what new cars can you buy for $15,000, $20,000? There's not a lot out there. You know, there's some pretty boring or sobering options. You know, would you rather own this or a Nissan Versa? And there's a place for cars like that.
Yeah, but someone buying a Versa has a different set of needs. But no, I know your point. Yeah.
Would you rather have this or a Mini? You have this.
Well,
Ooh, that was a good point to what else could you buy?
Yeah,
When
Mini.
you're
A lot of
talking
people
earlier.
like the Mini, but I'm not a
Chevy
Mini person.
Spark. Both are 2-seaters.
Oh, come on, the Spark has a backseat.
A Spark.
I only make those assumptions because both of my sisters chose those vehicles, and this car is just way better than those.
Yeah, than the Mini and the
Than the
Spark.
Mini and the
Well,
Spark.
but realistically though, the Miata is for most people going to be a second or third car that's going to be a weekend toy. And as a car that fits that purpose, this is probably the best car in the world for that. For something that's affordable and reliable. And that's why it's a success.
So, yeah. Now, why buy this car? It's all about the experience. It's about having fun.
Yeah.
It's about reminding yourself that driving isn't just about getting from one place to another or the drudgery of the commute.
It doesn't
on a
have to
daily
be,
basis.
right? Yeah.
You can have fun even while going to work in this car. You don't have to spend a lot of money. The maintenance isn't as severe as a European car. Honestly, I tell people that wonder about owning a car like this and don't need the extra space. They've said, can you really own a car like this? You know, is that expensive? No, it's not. I know people that literally have moved from Toyota Corollas to a car like this that was just, you know, a single person, and they find that, you know, the maintenance is just as cheap. They'll go 200,000+ miles with very few issues, if none,
Yeah.
and just enjoy it every day and drive it.
And it's something we can do together on the weekends.
So basically, do you have any regrets getting this car? You know,
Absolutely
for what you
not.
paid for it. I mean, I sold it to you for a good price, but
Absolutely not. This is a good step better than the NC. That was better as far as space and a couple practical things, but performance-wise, the way it looks,
My confidence in driving it.
they just nailed this car. It looks good to me.
out of all the cars that I've owned, this ND is probably my favorite of all the
Took care of
sports
it.
cars that I've had. I mean, certainly, but again, that's my preference on sports car. I want something light and small and flickable and fun like this. But now the ND, you get the styling, you get power, you get something that's legitimately quick, 0 to 60, not like the old Miatas were. And it's just a package that's hard to beat.
You were saying earlier, you know, that it's an odd of numbers car when we were talking about the horsepower. But
Yeah.
in all seriousness, even the numbers on this car, the acceleration,
It's a
the
lot better than
braking,
the old ones.
the,
Yeah.
the road holding and the grip, this is the quickest Miata out of the factory that's ever been made.
Oh,
0
yeah.
to 60 is under 6 seconds. That's not slow.
It's
It's
not
not fast,
slow.
but it's definitely not slow.
But it's the fun you have. It's the experience of driving it. It's shifting it at the red line. It's flying around corners, and it's a sensation of speed you get with an open top car that you can't get in a closed top car. So
So, what's my takeaway on this? For all those doubters or haters out there that have never been in a Miata and think that, you know, maybe that's just a secretary's car or a hairdresser's car, whatever derogatory thing you want to say about, I laugh at those people because I say, get in one, try one, it'll transform you. These cars are great.
when they went from NC to ND, didn't the power go down a little bit?
It
peak
did.
Horsepower?
So the prior generation hovered around 167 to 170 horsepower on paper.
Yeah.
When they debuted this car in the US and Canadian market, they brought it out with a new generation 2-liter 4-cylinder, so same size motor as the NC, but this time it was rated at 155 horsepower. Well, naturally, a lot of people, both from current owners to people who were already Miata critics,
Yeah.
didn't like the fact that it was less on paper. But what Mazda did here was they greatly increased the torque and the torque delivery of the car. It's got a much lower torque punch on it. And so driving around town and in normal circumstances, this car feels a good bit quicker than the NC.
Yeah, the older engine, you had to rev it a lot more. And so what they did by giving you torque down lower, the car feels faster.
Yeah.
Even though, so don't believe, numbers on paper, you have to look at the actual dyno chart, but you're not driving everywhere at 7,000 RPM. So you have to look at that. This car drives, it feels more powerful. And then for ND2, for 2019, they bumped it up by basically
26 horsepower.
That's really significant.
That's a very significant jump.
Because you're already starting with a low number. So going from
155.
55 to what is the ND2?
181.
That's a big jump because it's not like going
Percentage-wise.
from 600 horsepower to 620, but percentage-wise, because it's already a small number, that's a big deal.
There's another part of this equation too that you have to factor in. The Indy generation lost several hundred pounds from the prior car.
So we should talk about weight. The Miata
Power to weight ratio.
The Miata's always been known for lightweight. Now, the NA was pretty light, obviously back then, but they didn't have all the safety equipment, the structure engineering they have to do now. Then it started to creep up in weight, right? Because the NB was a little heavier, the MC was heavier again, but then with ND, did they finally reverse that trend?
They did, and the car in some configurations lost over 200 pounds from the prior generation.
That's really hard to do.
So one of the targets on this car was to get it back to the weight of the original car. This car in 2016 basically weighs what my 1996 one does. It's a little bit above 2,300 pounds. And that is extremely impressive, not only because of the safety that you have here, but the chassis rigidity, the stiffness, and let's not overlook the creature comforts that you get these days. This car does have all the power amenities that you would expect in any modern car. You also, for the first time, have a screen atop the dash with an infotainment system. And yet they dropped a couple hundred pounds. I find that very impressive. So
we should talk about handling, because that's really why you buy a small lightweight car like the Miata. A lot of this is hard to quantify, right?
Yes.
You can look at a skid pad number on whatever car, Corvette or something, and say, well, it handles better. Ultimate grip is different from how a car feels and how much enjoyment you get on a twisty road. Like for me, driving this back-to-back with my Mustang, I much prefer this. I'll take this any day on a twisty road over a Mustang. Now, but it's just different. It's a different kind of car than that. It's not a muscle car.
Yeah.
It's a car for the corners.
Absolutely. If you were to pin me down and say, why buy a Miata, and you can only give me one reason, it would be because of the handling and the feel that comes with that handling. Like Ian said, he has owned a Mustang GT prior, great motor, fast car. I currently own a muscle sedan with quite a bit of power that's also known for being a pretty decent handling car for what it is.
Well, you just say what it is. You own a Chevy SS.
Yeah, I own a 2016 Chevrolet SS, so that's an Americanized version of a Holden sold from Australia.
It's basically a four-door Corvette.
Corvette LS3.
If you're a car person, you know what it is.
Yeah.
But that's a special car, and we should review that someday.
Absolutely, but totally different feel you get from a car like this. It's a very tactile vehicle. You can feel everything through the fingertips in the wheel, the weighting of the shifter, and by the way, Miata shifters are among the best in the world. I think maybe second only to some Porsches.
Yeah, the shifting is amazing on these cars.
And this car is no different from that. It has a very well-defined gate, very snick action, just a complete joy to drive. The clutch feels great. Everything, when the car is starting to bite, when the car is starting to lose grip, you can just feel at all four corners what's going on.
Yeah, the only shifter that I've ever felt was as good as this was, like in a Porsche product. Maybe, and that was it.
Yeah.
Now, I do want to mention that we're filming this in the USA, okay? This is California, so I'm saying that because worldwide cars have different variations. They could have different engines, they could have different options. So it's a US car. This is the 2.5 liter, no.
2 liter.
I'm sorry. This is the 2-liter engine. In other countries, they offer a smaller engine as well. It's
Yeah.
a 1.
I think it's a 1.5.
I think it's a 1.5. I think you're right. We'll put the info here. But in the U.S., they only get the 2-liter. There's no
Yeah.
smaller engine. So keep that in mind. We're talking about the 2-liter engine.
So in 2019, Mazda completely reworked this motor. It still displaces 2 liters. It's still a 4-cylinder. It's naturally aspirated. But they did some trickery in the heads, made the vehicle, the whole engine just flow better. And so it picked up that 26 horsepower that we talked about earlier.
Yeah.
But I think a lot of people get stuck on that 26 horsepower, and a lot of them really like that. Oh, okay, that's a good percentage bump. But it's the drivability of that motor and the way that it performs that I think is really cool. They increased the red line from, I think, around 6,800 on this car to 7,500 RPM. And that is so
Big
key
difference
in this car because they love to rev. And
it's so much fun. If you've driven these, first of all, if you haven't driven one, go drive one of these. I'm telling you, it's one of the best driving experiences that you can have at any price. Revving these things out on a twisty road is one of the best things I've ever done. I just love taking this thing to redline, shifting it hard. I mean, it's so much fun, and it's sad that someday in the future, probably those kind of driving experiences won't exist. Either because cars are electric or because, manuals have gone away. But I'm telling you, enjoy this kind of thing while you can.
yeah, so I think that 7,500 RPM red line is a really important thing they did to the motor. Because if I were to criticize this powertrain a little bit, it would be what happens above about 6,000 RPM. I feel like it starts tapering off a bit, and it didn't quite have the rev-happy nature that some of the previous generation Miata engines did. So, and Mazda originally, when they built that smaller displacement one for the non-US and Canadian markets, it was because they really wanted a good experience, a good high revving, very engaging dynamic, and that was what they were trying to achieve with the new evolution of the 2-liter in 2019.
Well, we should probably talk about, if you're in the market for one of these, and theoretically you are, maybe if you're watching this video, you're going to be looking at a lot of different competition. Now, we talked about this, and the interesting thing is that what you're looking for with a car like this is a fun car, like a sports car, weekend type car. So you might be comparing it to an old Miata. You might be comparing it to something more expensive or less expensive. You might be saying, oh, do I want a BRZ or do I want to go up in price and get something like a Supra, for a little bit more money, especially now that they have the one with the smaller engine, right? It's cheaper. So why don't we talk about some things to consider if you're going to buy one of these, either new or used, versus what else you can get and what the ups and downs would be. So what are the most obvious things? Like if you were looking to replace this, let's say this was totaled, what would you look at in comparison to this?
Yeah, so if I was trying to stick to something, on the newer end like this, the most natural vehicle out there right now is probably the Subaru BRZ Scion FRS / Toyota 86 trio, which was a joint venture between Subaru and Toyota to develop a rear-wheel drive manual transmission sports car. But it's different than the Miata, and we've both driven that car, and there are some things I like about it, and then there are some things that really didn't appeal to me. One of them being the Boxer 4-cylinder motor.
Yeah, I don't like that engine in that car. It just feels, it doesn't feel refined, it doesn't make a good sound, it feels kind of gruff. I don't know, my initial impression of driving, because when that car came out, I went and test drove one. And I came away thinking, I will just never buy that. Now, no offense to people who like them, they're a great platform, I admit that. But I knew right away it wasn't for me. Plus the obvious fact of, there's no convertible version of that. So if the convertible, that's one factor of it, right? Yeah. If you want the outside world coming into your cabin, you want the air, the wind, the sun, then it restricts your options a lot more. If you're willing to have a closed top car, then you could look at those other options. But if you want a convertible, then your options get really, really narrow at that point.
And that's funny what you said about your initial impression of the FRS and BRZ or Toyota 86, because I had the same one. I drove that car when I only owned the NA, but I had driven plenty of Miatas up to that point. I actually drove to the dealer in my 1996, and it was funny because when I left, in a way, I felt like I couldn't get back into my 96 Miata quick enough. Because even though compared to something more pedestrian, like a 4-cylinder automatic, mid-size sedan today, it didn't have that same tactile feel that the Miata did for me. And again, yeah, you're missing the ability to take down the roof. And for me, in owning a sports car or a roadster, that's a big part of the experience with the Miata that you just can't get in one of those two cars. And it's also a bigger car. It's a 4-seater. Now, it's not one that you're really going to want to put people in the back seat of, but it's got a longer wheelbase. You've got more weight, a couple hundred pounds. And even if you were to make that car a convertible, it's going to gain even more weight. And you could have a car that weighs, 500-600 pounds more than this.
It's a different car. It's larger. I mean, it is more practical. From a
Yes.
practical point of view, it beats the heck out of this.
You can fit 4 wheels and tires in that car and go to your track day and swap them
you can't
out.
do that in this. So there's a lot of those considerations that you would have to make. But as a weekend toy, this is way better. It just is. I mean,
Absolutely.
I don't think many people would argue that part. If it's more of a daily driver or practical considerations, then the BRZ is going to be better for that.
Yeah. I think another car that I would have to go to if you said, buy something on the new end that sort of has the same idea as this would maybe be a Nissan 370Z.
Yeah, and I've driven that quite a bit. I'm sure you've driven them, and of course the older 350s. That's there. But it's a lot heavier car, a lot more powerful. It doesn't have the roadster feel.
Yeah, it feels a little more on the touring / grand touring end than,
For sure.
than a roadster. And
Yeah.
I think the weight is a big part of that. Now, that VQ V6 that Nissan's been using forever,
Since the Model T came
basically the Nixon era.
Yeah. It's good though.
Definitely a lot faster than this in a straight line.
Yeah, it's got like 330 some horsepower in it. Yeah, that's a good engine, but the Z is a heavier, larger car. It's not quite the same thing. But you might compare that to this. What else would you look at? I mentioned the Supra because now a fully loaded RF version of this is what, pushing 36, 37?
Well, I think now with the 30th anniversary car, which
that's a
has
special edition.
still, but with every conceivable option and in that RF with the hardtop Targa section, you're pushing your $40,000 in that car. And at that point, I think the value equation starts to become a tougher one to justify.
Yeah.
And at $40,000, now I'm having to look at quite a few other options, and that's where something like even, a not too old Porsche Boxster starts to come into play.
Oh, well, that's okay. So that's sort of the elephant in the room for me is something like a Boxster. Now, not a new one, unless you have a lot of means and you can do that. But for most people, that's going to be out of their price range. But you could get a used one.
Yep.
And there's different generations of Boxster, and that's the whole thing to go into that. But the Supra. Okay, so let's deal with the Supra first.
Yeah.
So you can get a Supra for what, low 40s, right?
Yeah.
Because of the new version that they have.
Now that they've brought out the turbo 4-cylinder version, they've cut quite a bit of cost out of
And of
that.
course, because it's turbo, if you want more power, you basically just turn up the turbo. Now, there's implications of that, but it's tunable.
Absolutely.
Right?
And you definitely get a 2-seater sports car kind of dynamic with that.
Not a convertible again.
Not a convertible. Where it starts to fall apart a little bit for me beyond just the fact that, that car is competing with the most expensive, newest Miatas, is that now you're stuck with an 8-speed automatic transmission. For me, that's what kind of kills it.
It's a good automatic.
It is a very good automatic.
But no stick shift is going to be a deal breaker for a lot of you, and probably for both of us too. I mean, if you really want a weekend toy, if you're a really car person, you probably want a manual. And I think that, the Supra's an amazing car. I love it. But without a manual, I don't know. I don't know.
Yeah.
If you were commuting in traffic a lot, and again, some of those more practical considerations came in, and if you have to sit in a traffic jam, an automatic is a better way to go. But
let's not forget, you can also get one of these cars with an automatic.
that's true. You can buy a Miata automatic for sure. And actually, it is a large percentage of sales.
Oh, it absolutely is, and it responds pretty well to the paddles.
Yeah, it's a good automatic in the Miatas.
Yep.
But, okay, so we talked about the Supra. We both like it, but it's a little bit different of a car. No drop top, it's a bit more of a tourer, but they did an amazing job with it. And the engines in that are really good.
Yep.
Okay, going to the Boxster idea, that's complicated because it depends on what generation of Boxster you were looking at. I guess what I would say as an overview there is you really need to do your homework extremely well. Because when you get into a German car like that, not just a German car, but especially a Porsche, certain generations have flaws, and if something big breaks, you're done. Like your budget is blown. Like it could be, I mean, to put an engine or a transmission or something major into those cars,
You're talking five figures.
is more than
You're
the price
talking
of
$10,000-$20,000 depending on what components.
these
you're
for the
talking
most
about.
part, these don't break, right? And that's why this is so great. With Boxster, you're potentially having some catastrophic failure. I'm not saying that they're unreliable, but there are certain years of those that will potentially have catastrophic failures.
Yeah.
The IMS, I mean, certain
That's probably the most famous.
the IMS
issue.
variant is the most famous. Now, I should probably do a video on this someday, but I actually owned a 911 of the 996
Yeah.
generation for one day. And the reason I owned it for one day is because as I was driving it off the dealership lot, the engine had catastrophic failure due to the IMS bearing. I was very glad that I was within the warranty period on the used car. It was a used car when I bought it. And I've never touched Porsche again after that experience because the replacement cost of the engine was something like $25,000, which is about what I paid for the entire car.
Now, Ian, do tell me, what did you trade in that day for that 911 that you bought? And then what did you end up leaving the dealership with?
I traded in my beautiful Nordic green, that's the color.
Yes.
Nordic green 2006 NC,
Grand Touring in
which
great
would
shape.
serve me faithfully for years at that point. Survived hitting a deer at 50 miles an hour. I traded it in for the stupid 996 because I got sucked in by it. And the engine blew up the first day, the whole thing. The dealership ended up taking it back. They were very good about it. And I drove away the next day in my NC and was
In
happy
your Nordic
to...
Green 2006 Miata
I happily
Grand Touring.
continued driving the Miata and I've never bought a Porsche since then. But it's just an example to show you that those things are actually real. Like they can actually happen to you. And if you're out of warranty or you don't have the financial wherewithal to deal with that, you're going to be in serious trouble.
Yeah.
And that's not going to happen with the Miata.
Yeah, I mean, that could be a catastrophic situation for somebody buying a $10,000 to $20,000 car.
Yeah.
Thinking that they're getting this great experience and then are presented with a $10,000 to $20,000 repair bill. I mean, that may be impossible for some people to deal with.
So you really got to do, if you're looking at exotic cars, whether it's an M3, whether it's a Boxster, whatever it might be, some of the older Mercedes products, you really have to do your homework and know what you're getting into there because you can get into major financial problems with those cars. So you could pull a Doug DeMuro. Wasn't this whole thing used to be CarMax with the warranty?
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
And you get the warranty and you drive like a Jaguar, and you knew it was going to break.
Yeah.
But you have. So yeah, look into those things. But the Boxster is probably its most natural competitor, other than the price being way higher. And I love the Boxster myself. I still plan on owning a Boxster someday. I really like the way it drives. I like the way they look. But if I own one, it'll be either a newer one or under warranty somehow.
I think that's kind of funny that you say that it's the Miata's natural competitor, because if you talk about apples to apples, brand new car, the price difference is just ungodly.
But some people have the means to do it.
Correct. And that's one of the other neat things about the Miata. It's what I would call a classless car. It's a vehicle that somebody with not a lot of means can buy.
Yeah.
It's something that somebody that can afford a $200,000 exotic also can buy and enjoy, and not be ashamed or embarrassed to be seen in.
Yeah, I mean, we know people that have these alongside some very expensive cars that they won't even talk about, or they have that resource, but they still drive one of these.
Yep, I know somebody that is a habitual Acura NSX and Miata owner. He's constantly buying both of those cars, and you could argue those are very disparate cars, even though they're both sports cars.
Enough price.
You know, but with the Boxster, it's interesting that you still say it's the natural competitor, and I think the reason you're right on that is because of the driving dynamics in the field.
Yeah.
If you actually look at the specs, they're not very close. I mean, you're talking about a front-engine car versus a mid-engine car. That is so fundamentally different, right from the forefront. But it's what happens when you get behind the wheel, when you're shifting it. The way you feel and the way that the car communicates with you, that's where I would say the two are very close. But just different in the way they communicate.
And I'm kind of weird with the Boxsters because when I've driven them, I actually prefer the ones with the smaller engines. Like I would get the base one because I don't want too much power. Then it gets to be more of a muscle car. I like the smaller engine that I have to rev more and work harder. Because here's the thing with the Miata, and I think with cars and motorcycles in general, and we should have a whole video on this, but it's more fun, you probably heard the saying, it's more fun to drive a slow car fast than a fast car slow. And that is the most true thing I've ever heard. Because running this thing as fast as it can go is so much more satisfying than having a 500 horsepower car and not being able to use its potential. Because you're not driving on a track, you're driving in the real world. You're driving on streets, on ramps, twisty roads in the country.
You can extract so much more out of this car than some of these high-powered muscle cars on a daily basis, which the joy factor just goes through the roof versus the experience of driving one of those.
So we bored the poor audience to death talking about the competition ad nauseum. I mean, those are things you could think of, but it's hard for the value for money, the reliability, the fun to drive. This is the car for that. It just kind of is. I mean, you could choose something else and that's fine, and there's good options, but it's so hard to beat this, and that's why you see so many of these in sports car clubs. It races at your racetrack, autocross. You just can't really beat them, and I'm just worried that someday Mazda will say, you know what, we can't afford to do it anymore.
Yeah. There's another interesting thing about these cars in general, and that's the aftermarket support and the performance potential.
Yeah,
a
rabbit hole, but
a lot of the people out there are naysayers on the performance of this car. Oh, it's only a 4-cylinder. Oh, it only has.
Yeah, but it only weighs like 2,300 pounds too.
So my wife and I have both autocrossed these cars, both this 2016 and our 96, and there's something that works very well even outside of just the ability of extracting a lot of performance on the street with these. I was out there on this particular day with BMWs making well over twice the horsepower, Corvettes, Mustangs, other cars that were even set for the track with decent suspension. But because of the weight of this car, setting the times and the numbers that I did was a lot easier than what these guys were having to deal with out there. And you know what? Both of them took that beating on a 100-degree day, lap after lap, for hours without anything going wrong. And I couldn't say that about some of the other more exotic competition that was out there that day.
I mean, going into your aftermarket point, I mean, you can tune these cars. The parts are crazy. We can talk briefly about the changes you've done to this car, but the point is that you can modify it for more power. You can, put grippier tires on. You can put in stiffer springs, sway bars. You can get superchargers, turbochargers. It's a platform for whatever you want it to be. Now, for my personal opinion, is that sometimes with mods, you end up just chasing problems after problem. You change one thing and then it's out of balance. You have to go change something else, or whatever. And if you're a car person and you've been down that road, you know exactly what I'm talking about. But there are things you can do to make it a better Miata. Give it a little bit more power, give it a little more grip. These are known for kind of having too much body roll and things like that, which Mazda will say is intentional, right? And they want that, but most of the drivers tend to want a little bit less body roll. So why don't you tell us well, I guess you and I both have modded this car, because we both owned it. But I don't remember, honestly, what I did to it when I owned it.
So under the hood, we have a few modifications here. We've got an open flash header on it, combined with the open flash tune.
Okay, and tune and header is the most bang for buck
Yep.
on one of these you can get. Now that's the ND1. I don't know on the ND2 how much that is anymore.
I don't know what the gains are, but I have been told that the gains on the ND2 over, stock versus the ND1
Yeah.
are not as big
They're
because,
not as big.
frankly, Mazda has addressed some of those
They
things
kind of just
in
did
making
it.
the engine flow better.
They kind of just did that on their own, right?
Yeah, and interestingly,
Because the header was a big choke point on this.
yeah, and I've driven an ND2, so that's the interesting thing because this car is estimated to have somewhere between maybe an extra 20 to 30, maybe 32 horsepower more than
Yeah,
stock.
I mean, when you put the tune on this and do the header, it's like, wow, it's a lot.
Night and day.
Yeah, it is. The ND2 has most of that gain built in, which is nice. I would prefer that personally because I'm buying a car that's not modified and has the more power, and I don't have to worry about legalities of being in California or different things like that. Right?
Yeah, I'll tell you what I would do if money wasn't part of the equation. I would go out there and I'd buy that ND2, and I would probably put a tune on it to give it that same kind of more aggressive response that this car has. Because I've driven the ND2 in stock form, and even though on paper the numbers are probably close, I can still tell you this car with a tune feels a lot quicker and a lot more responsive than the ND2 does. Outside of just those changes that you did, I went and finished the exhaust off with full mid-pipe, full muffler, specifically designed for a header so that you wouldn't get such terrible drone.
Right.
And I
you
have to
match your exhaust system.
Yeah, and I have to give a lot of props to Goodwin Racing located in San Diego,
Yeah.
California, because he makes some really good parts for these cars, and he races them, they track them all the time, and so they really put their money where their mouth is, test those parts, and are constantly trying to develop and make them better. Same with companies like Flying Miata. There's a lot of good companies out there that support these vehicles.
They really support the community. I mean, there's
Yes.
forums. They work with the owners, and you have a lot of great support to go to.
Yeah.
They really are part of the community, and that's one of the things about owning a car like this is you're not just buying a car, you're buying into a community and a culture, and that is really something that I think the Miata does really well. There's other cars that have cultures and communities and clubs around them. Corvettes, Porsches, German cars, things like that, or just general sports car clubs. But the Miata community seemed to be one of the best out there. And we both belong. Well, you do belong to the club because you have this car. I always was a member of the local Miata club, and I loved that experience. The club drives and the meets and things like that. But you still enjoy that.
Yeah, absolutely. My wife and I love that sense of community and just the fun drives that we take
So
with
they,
other people.
they don't have kids, so they have time to go actually have fun. I changed diapers, but but before I did that, I was part of that too, and it was an awesome thing to do. Just like those of you who may be motorcyclists, you get that community sense and the camaraderie. You can get the same thing in the car world.
Now, onto the stock performance of this car, there was one thing you mentioned that I would say is kind of, for me, the Achilles heel, and that's the body roll that comes with this car from the factory. I feel like it was more than any of the previous generation cars, and for me at least, it takes some of the fun factor out of it. Some of the Mazda engineering team has said it's about giving people more of the communication and feeling as the car leans and being able to feel how much grip is available. Personally, I think the car has such a good chassis and so much potential inherently in it that it suffers a little bit from that extra body roll. But again, that's something that you can easily address in a number of ways, which I have, and we both experimented with some things on this car.
Well, I put in stiffer springs, which kind of ruined the ride.
Yeah.
And again, this goes to my thing about chasing problems. You change the springs without changing the dampers or the shock body themselves. It's out of balance. So then you have to consider your shocks. You have to consider your sway bars. Then you have to consider how that impacts the braking, how that impacts the tires and the grip you have. Everything, you have to look at everything as a package. You can't just say, oh, I'm going to give my car more power and that's going to be great. No, everything affects everything else. So you really have to consider the overall balance. And sometimes what happens is you mess up the balance that the manufacturer gave the vehicle from the start. So you have to be careful of that. Especially if you do crazy stuff like turbos and things like that.
And in 2016, so this particular version is a mid-trim level, a club, but it was also the most performance-oriented version at the time. And you get some visual things like the front arrow splitter, some of these black accents like on the spoiler, the mirrors, but the other things it has are the Bilstein dampers and the limited slip differential. Personally, I don't think the Bilstein dampers from the factory are that great, and they're not very well matched to the springs that Mazda used that are a little bit too soft. And you know, one of the things that we tried was the Progress Technology springs, which, like you said, I think made the ride just a little bit too brittle. It did take care of the body roll pretty well.
Yeah.
I continue to mess with it and experiment. I've now gone to a different spring that's a little bit softer, but I still retain the Bilstein dampers, and then I added sway bars to it to take care of some of the body roll.
The
But
sway bars, I was going to do that next when I sold it to you. So when you get it all perfected, you're going to sell it back to me for really cheap, right? So
yeah, maybe to get an ND2.
yeah, you'll get that, or actually I'll get an ND2 to piss you off, and then
Okay.
you can drive this old hunk of junk around.
Okay, and I'll still wax you on the
You'll
track.
still be faster because you're a better driver, but oh boy. So we really should talk about, you know, this is a long-term review, an owner review, so talk about some of the complaints with it and some of how things have worn, anything that's gone wrong, any interior things that are not wearing good. I mean, this car is 4 years old at this point.
Yeah.
It's not that old, but still, it's got, how many miles are on this?
Yeah, I
girl?
think we're right at about 26,000 miles
So
now.
she's clapped out. She's
So, yeah, you know, it's a first-year car of a new generation. There haven't really been any of those teething issues that a lot of people have had, and I've found that that's typically the case with Miatas, where they seem to keep those.
I'm going to
really-
grab the camera and actually, you know, take some video of some of these aspects that I'm noticing in the interior.
Okay, so, do you want me to keep going?
Yeah.
So yeah, there's nothing really major that I've noticed wrong with this car. It's more little things that I wished maybe they had done differently or better or could be improved upon. And a lot of that is kind of how I fit and how passengers fit in this car ergonomically. To me, this car just plain feels narrower and tighter than the prior generation. These seats, Mazda did something interesting in an effort to save weight. One of those being that they didn't use any springs in the seats, and they kind of used, I believe it was like a net to kind of support you. And I just don't find the seats very comfortable beyond maybe an hour drive. But I had the same complaint with my NC. Now I know Mazda can do better than this, because in my first gen car, that's a car I can actually drive for several hours on a long trip. And I just find that I don't have the backaches that I do in this car. These cup holders in this car, like, this isn't what a Miata is about, but at the end of the day, sometimes you need your cup of coffee, you need your water, and I just find this solution utterly ridiculous.
Well, the problem is it's in the way of your arm, right?
It's
when
in the
you're
way of
driving?
your arm, but even that.
But they've never been able to really fit good cup holders.
Like-
The NC2 had the best cup holders, maybe.
It did. It absolutely did.
We'll
But
put a photo.
these don't.
But you
hold,
can put that cup holder up here in this
yeah,
slot.
and these don't hold crap though. I mean, these are
Yeah,
not strong
they
enough.
don't
They're
hold
they're not.
anything in.
They should have made them taller with some kind of springs that hold better. And just doing that by itself would have made them
But
better.
isn't there a cup holder in that, or what is this the compartment here? I don't even remember.
So you can see you can move that cup holder there, which I
Yeah.
actually prefer if you don't have.
But
a
what about
passenger.
this?
This is just a place where
that's
you can
storage.
barely fit anything.
So you just got trash because you're a mess. But
No, you just put 4 thimbles in there so you
Thimbles?
can do your sewing.
you can put your, you know, I don't know what you put in there.
You know, but this is the kind of thing that I feel like Mazda could and probably will do better within a couple of years. You know, they could
But
have
the
used.
Miata's always been challenged for interior storage and practicality because there's just no room. I mean, they're trying to make it as small and light as they can.
But what I've found now.
But you can't even, if you can't even put a water bottle and a phone and a wallet, it gets a little bit old, you know.
But what I've found now in several generations of Miata is that they do better as they go to, you know, updates on these generations. So I hope they can figure out stuff like that. You know, all right, what else?
Show us the trunk and what's in it.
So
corpse.
here is your ND Miata trunk, which
What
is
is that, by
around
the way?
4.5 cubic feet of
That's
space.
how you carry your stuff, is a sack?
Well, we don't talk about what's in there.
Oh,
But-
okay.
Anyway, yes, let's just be honest. Miata trunks have never been large. But again,
But you could fit, could you fit a bag of golf clubs in it?
probably not.
This-
Maybe for very short
Well, then I don't
people.
want it because I
Special-
only just
special
go golfing
cut down
on
ones.
weekends.
But no, in all seriousness, Mazda has done better than this. It's always been a tiny trunk, but I feel like with each generation, they somehow find a way to make it smaller. So I wonder if there is a 5th generation car, are we going to be down to the point that all you can fit are some sewing needles and a thimble? It's getting a little ridiculous.
Yeah, it is kind of challenging with the size of the trunk. That's one hard. Even to take like a 4-day trip with your spouse.
It's difficult.
It's hard to pack your stuff.
It's very difficult.
So that's something. But the Miata has always had that challenge.
Now, an interesting counterpoint to that is the Fiat 124 Spider.
Why is it bigger?
So the Fiat 124 Spider, we haven't even talked about that. That was a car that spun off of this ND generation Miata in 2017. And basically, it's the same as this car,
Yeah.
except they have a little bit different front fascia and a little bit different rear end. They actually lengthened this area and the one at the hood, made them a little bit taller. And with that car's got like half a cubic foot more space. And that doesn't sound like much, but
It doesn't sound like
but when
much.
you're starting with 4.5, a half cubic foot of space, you notice that in this car.
Yeah, but it's not. I mean, it's not dramatically different. I mean, it's
They also use a little bit nicer interior materials in that car. So, if you might be looking for a little
yeah, but these
higher
aren't
end
bad.
leather-
This was a pretty nice upgrade from the previous Miata.
It was.
NC.
I like the way the interior of this car looks. It matches
Yeah, I
the
do too.
outside very well. They
Yeah.
managed to include an infotainment system in a car that a lot of people thought would be blasphemy to have this, but honestly, it works well.
No, it's not bad.
It doesn't get in the way of your vision.
I mean, we know the complaints about Mazda's infotainment. It's beating a dead horse at this point if you've watched car videos because it's not very good. You can put Android. This one has Android Auto, doesn't it? 'Cause
No,
didn't we upgrade
no,
it to that?
this doesn't have Android Auto.
But you can do that though.
Hey, I think people are a little bit hard on the Mazda Connect infotainment system.
Yeah, it's not as bad as they say.
I'll tell you why. It doesn't have all the bells and whistles of like some of the better systems, which I'd say like GM and FCA makes with their Uconnect, and maybe Hyundai, they make a pretty good infotainment system. But the reason that I think this is okay is because it's intuitive, something that a lot of these new systems now are not. It doesn't have all the fancy functionality, but you know what? You don't need to read some manual for an hour to understand how to use it. And the rotary controller, again.
Yeah, I like
it's-
how
it's-
the control. I like the control setup. My problem is the software.
Yes.
It's kind of slow and clunky.
Yes.
The actual human interface part is fine for me. And when I owned this card, I had hacked it where you could use the touchscreen while driving and the various other things, which you can do. It's not approved by Mazda, but you can. It's a Linux-based system, and without going into all the detail, you can actually modify it by putting an SD card in there and changing the software. So it's kind of user customizable if you're willing to be a hacker in that way. You got to film in the garage because it's so windy. It's the life of being an amateur YouTube person. Well, not that fast.